Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Lorraine Byrne Bodley. I'm Professor of Musicology at Maynooth University and President of the Society for Musicology in Ireland. Part of the privilege of being President is having a platform to give thanks to those who've organised this conference, to those who've presented papers and to those who've gathered to listen and respond. When I took up this presidency 6 years ago, I wanted to build on what Harry, Jan and Kerry had achieved for graduate welfare because of the wonderful doctoral and postdoctoral fellows I've worked with, encounters which have enriched me greatly. One of the privileges of being president has been the opportunity to get to know graduates across the country and internationally and to be uplifted by the inspiring work you're doing. I've come to really love this conference. This is my last graduate conference as president, so I want to express particularly sincere and heartfelt thanks this year. There are many reasons why this year's postgraduate conference is special. On behalf of SMI and my colleagues at Maynooth University, I pay very sincere tribute to our late colleague Dr David Connolly, whose death shocked us so deeply last April, and whom Gerard has memorialised so beautifully. We wanted to gather together in David's name to celebrate and showcase the very fine research that's been carried out around the country and still welcome our international friends. That's why we invited you to present short resumes of your research so we could include as many as possible in our celebration. On behalf of SMI, I extend our deepest sympathy to David's wife Linda, his mother Mary, brother Peter, his extended family, colleagues and many friends who've joined us for this conference. We didn't need to experience the isolation of lockdown to remind us how much music matters, how much musicology matters, or how much we mean to each other. That was very much in evidence at our last physical conference, which Anya Bunsell organised at Maynooth University, which David attended and which we all enjoyed so much. Of course we miss rallying round, the live papers, friends made in the pub afterwards, and look forward to a time where that will be possible again. Since we, like everyone else in the world, have had to adapt, and like many other societies move our conferences online, I've witnessed extraordinary cooperation among colleagues. I was completely bowled over by that in October as colleagues in UCD bravely hosted our first digital conference. It's significant that our founding president, Professor Harry White, chairs that conference, and Wolfgang Marx too was completely heroic in his efforts. Their conference committee, our council members, colleagues across the country, our international friends, did everything they could to make that conference the success it was. We're also quick to raise the bar for ourselves, that sometimes we don't notice our progress, and there is progress. It's an amazing coup to have brought 2 digital conferences off. This conference has built on the success of that plenary conference in UCD, and I'm so willing to shine a spotlight on the people hard at work making musicology in Ireland better. Firstly, I want to thank our wonderful conference committee, Fiona Baldwin, UCD, Rachel Duffy, TU Dublin, and Ian O'Connor, University of Limerick, all of whom have worked so closely with Brian and Hannah on aspects of programme assembly. Secondly, I want to single out Lauren Farquharson, DKIT, for contacting potential chairs and technical assistants. Thirdly, I want to thank Christina Lynn, DKIT, and Conor Power, Maynooth University, for liaising with performers at both institutions. There's surely no greater testimony to how wonderful our graduates are than the Dublin Musicology Collective, all rallying round in support of each other. I was thrilled when they agreed to collaborate with us, and characteristically their president, Anika Babel, was in like a shot, asking what they could do to help, arranging technical support sessions and offering to host a closing reception. Our Honorary Secretary, Damien Evans, has been his usual steady, watchful presence, always willing, always there, as is our super efficient web administrator, Paul Everett, who not only shares his technical knowledge, but his wisdom and experience, always seeking ways to improve the high standards he so naturally maintains. I'd be lost without our honorary treasurer, Denise Neary, who's so dependable and so easy to work with, and our founding president, Harry White, who's so watchful of best practice, so collegial, so ready to support me and other members of council, colleagues and students across the country. As always, Helen Lawler, chair of ICTM Ireland, has been an absolute joy to work with. Thanks to the good grace of Simon Trezise, we've been planning our first joint SMI ICTM Ireland plenary conference, which will take place in Trinity College, Dublin, the last weekend in May 2021. The call for papers is open and I invite you to submit proposals. Among the many highlights, the Irish Research Council Harrison Medal will be presented to Professor Michael Beckerman, New York University, who will give the Harrison Lecture at that conference. I want to thank dear Gerard Gillen, Linda Connolly, David Greeley, Eamon Goldove, John O'Keefe, Sharon Carty, Christopher Ellis for gracing this conference so beautifully with their musical gifts. I want to thank Glenn Stanley and Laura Watson for the long hours they spent reading all the doctorates that have been examined here over the past 2 years, which enabled us to present Bláithín Duggan the Harry White Graduate Prize. None of the above will object when I single out the 2 outstanding graduates who organised this conference, Hannah Millington and Brian Whitelaw. Both are an absolute dream to work with. Hannah joined our team when she applied for the position of part-time administrator for 6 months. She stayed on a voluntary basis and has made herself completely invaluable. Usually our graduate conference is hosted by a university where 1 or 2 students from that institute chair the conference team. This postgraduate event has been organised differently because it's a digital conference held in association with Maynooth University and Dundalk Institute of Technology, the 2 institutions where David worked. Hannah volunteered to organise it with Brian, and together they've made an exceptional team. Brian has been an outstanding student rep whose contribution on council has gone far beyond that role. He's responsible for the amazing interactive programme booklet with embedded Zoom links, for editing all the plenary videos and performances. When I look at the work you're both doing, I'm not just grateful to you, Hannah and Brian, for your energy, the gifts of your time, talent and collaboration, and everything you've done for this conference. You've given us so much more than that. I feel filled with hope to see the discipline flourishing and in such good hands. This brings me back to 2 points that I touched on at the beginning of the speech and which I want to return to close. The first is that desire to support graduates as I set out on this journey as president, which was also born of the recognition of just how challenging it is for you starting out, and I feel an ever-increasing sense of responsibility towards you. I want to endorse you in every way I can and to encourage you to have some rational confidence, because I personally believe challenges are there to transcend, to make us stronger and wiser. The second thing I want to return to and thank everyone for is the extraordinary teamwork on council across the country with our many international members and friends. We're all working as one extended team, with the sole goal of making musicology in Ireland better. David's gifts contributed to that, and yours do too. At a time when we're all isolated, I hope you feel part of something bigger than yourself. I know I do, and music is an essential source of that very real connection. I'm turning now to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Nicole Grimes, Irish musicologist and cultural historian, who's Associate Professor of Musicology at the University of California, Irvine. There are so many reasons for inviting Nicole as our keynote speaker. First and foremost, her exceptional scholarship. Secondly, she's a source of inspiration in so many ways. For a start, she's one of a number of members of our society who are now working abroad, bridging the gap between the experience they gained here and what they bring back to us in their homecomings. Thirdly, like many of you, Nicole was a graduate here. In 2008, she was awarded a PhD at Trinity College Dublin for her dissertation, Brahms Critics, Continuity and Discontinuity in the Critical Reception of Johannes Brahms. She subsequently held numerous postdoctoral positions. Her research was funded by a Deutscher Akademischer Austauschdienst at Humboldt University, Berlin, from 2007 to 8, and by the Irish Research Council at University College Dublin from 2009 to 10. And from 2011 to 2014, she was a Marie Curie Fellow funded by the European Commission, with joint affiliation at the University of California, Irvine and University College Dublin. Before taking up her professorship at UCI, she held faculty positions at Royal Holloway, the University of London and Keele University. Nicole is someone who has given and continues to give exceptionally. While establishing herself as a leading international scholar, she's maintained very strong links with Ireland. She's a member of SMI and has given regular plenary lectures. She's also a member of the advisory boards for Irish Musical Studies and the Institute for Austrian and German Music Research. She's a trustee of the Society for Music Analysis in the UK and a member of the editorial board of that society's journal, Music Analysis. She's vice president of the American Brahms Society. Together with J.P.E. Harper Scott, she's now series editor of the Cambridge Music Handbooks, relaunched by Cambridge University Press in late 2020. As this is a graduate conference, I want to go back to her beginnings, her first aspirations, and couple them with her most recent work, Brahms' Elegies, The Poetics of Loss in 19th Century German Culture, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. Her monograph is one of the most important books to have appeared on Brahms in recent decades. Important in bringing together the disciplines of historical musicology, German studies and cultural history, and important as a fixed point in the articulation of central and abidingly relevant questions about Brahms' music as it relates to loss and the German intellectual tradition. Whenever that question has been touched on before, it's been raised and treated rhetorically, rather than raised and properly addressed. To understand Brahms's music is the work of a lifetime for sure, but to understand it with a full comprehension of the German tradition of the Poetics of Loss that extends from late 18th century texts by Hölderlin, Schiller and Goethe set by Brahms, to understand its meaning in relation to other philosophical and poetic works in Brahms's library, and to understand it in relation to Adorno's aesthetics is an altogether more daunting proposition. And yet Brahms' Elegies, The Poetics of Loss in 19th Century German Culture, does all of this, certainly, definitively and productively. Nicole's multifaceted focus on endings, the end of tonality, the end of the 19th century, and themes of loss in the music, illuminates our understanding of the place of Brahms in the fabric of modernist culture. No book has done this before, and like all great critical works, it could have been written by nobody else than its author. Timely as this book is, its existence is something other than the function of the time being ripe. That the musicologist who wrote it is Nicole Grimes is no surprise, because when we look back at her early work, it appears, in the very best sense, an inevitability. In a very short space of time, Nicole has become one of Ireland's most distinguished musicologists and a central figure in defining Brahms scholarship in decades to come. Her work has already had a profound influence on larger questions of German culture, identity and musical imagination because it's never shirked them or made them appear less formidable than they really are. As this is a graduate conference, I want to highlight Professor Grimes's early academic work, which was of great originality and consequence. Her first major publication was a groundbreaking collection of essays, Rethinking Hanslick, Music Formalism and Expression, co-edited with Siobhan Donovan and Wolfgang Marx. Her second, Mendelssohn Perspectives, with Angela Mace, was crucially an act of deep attention directed towards Mendelssohn's music in and for itself, and the lessons learned through this were directly applicable to his contemporaries in German music criticism and more broadly music analysis and music aesthetics in the 19th century, as evident in her many articles and book chapters on Brahms, Schoenberg, Mendelssohn, Clara Schumann and Liszt, where her work is as broad and adventurous as it is principled and searching. In recent years, Nicole has extended this search into the 20th century and contemporary music scene, most recently writing on spectral composition in the music of the Irish composer Donnacha Dennehy. I had the pleasure of editing an essay she wrote for Music Preferred, Essays in Musicology, Cultural History and Analysis in honour of Harry White, in which she proposes a new historiographical methodology for thinking about a repertoire of German music and artworks across 2 centuries. What fascinated me most was her perception of aesthetic humanism as a temporal process, a spiritual journey which unfolds in time as she traces how a single poem sets in motion a chain of responses from Goethe through Brahms to Wolfgang Riem. Professor Grimes's keynote is another example of her fascination with the intertextual relationship between music and literature, music and poetry, music and philosophy. In it, she turns to Ali Smith's seasonal quartet of novels written between 2016 and 2019, in particular the 3rd book in that series, Spring, which has woven into it Beethoven's Die Hoffnung, dedicated to hope. I can see so much of Nicole in this keynote, from the strength of Ali Smith's female protagonists to the author's unwavering belief in art and openness to the European tradition, at a time when that tradition is being questioned and when borders are being imposed in Europe, the place from which that rich and diverse tradition arises. Tige's poem, Die Hoffnung, lands us back into the post-Enlightenment religious crisis and the beginnings of modernity, as the protagonist opens with the existential question, is there a God? Ali Smith's coupling of the complex issues of migration with Beethoven's song dedicated to hope, 200 years after it was composed, addresses the global refugee crisis that lies at the heart of her work. As is traditional with her keynote lectures, there will be no questions. Instead, Professor Grimes's lecture will lead directly to a performance of Bach's Vergnügte Ruh, beliebte Seelenlust, recorded in memory of David Connolly by my colleague John O'Keefe in St. Patrick's College Chapel, Maynooth University. Afterwards, we warmly invite all delegates and everyone gathered to join us for a post-conference virtual catch-up and mingle initiated by the Dublin Musicology Collective. But before then, we welcome and look forward to Professor Grimes's keynote lecture, Die Hoffnung, a musical footnote to Ali Smith's Spring, at the outset of 2021.
Good evening to the communities of SMI and ICTM. I'd like to express my warmest thanks to Professor Lorraine Byrne Bodley for that very kind and most generous introduction. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Professor Byrne Bodley and Dr. Helen Lawler for having invited me to deliver this keynote lecture. It's a great honour for me to address this joint conference and to speak to the community that had a formative influence on my development and continues to sustain and nourish me intellectually. It's a particular joy for me to address this student conference for the very simple reason that my students enrich and stimulate all of my intellectual endeavours. I wish to add a brief note following the tragic and untimely death of Dr. David Connolly. On the occasion of the SMI plenary conference at Maynooth University in 2019, one of our students from Irvine in California, Sarah Lindmark, travelled to Ireland. David took the trouble to give a group of us a guided tour of Pugin Hall and to show us the inner workings of the beautiful organ at the college chapel. It was a distinct highlight of that conference, and it meant a great deal, particularly when we had visitors from abroad. It spoke to a generosity of spirit and a passion for art that will be greatly missed. I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Hannah Millington and Brian Whitelaw and all of the team who are responsible for having organised this tremendously wonderful conference. I also feel duty-bound to assure you that any of the technical wizardry you are about to see is thanks to Brian Whitelaw. He somehow magically finds the time for these technical feats, even as he finishes his PhD dissertation on Liszt. My admiration for his scholarship over the years is no less vibrant than my gratitude for his vital role in preparing this online presentation. In her novel Summer, the fourth instalment in her seasonal quartet, the Scottish author Ali Smith asks the perennial question of whether the artist should portray their own age. Each of the four novels in this quartet heavily deploys intertextuality. All four are in conversation with the Shakespeare play. Each of the books begins with a witty interchange with Charles Dickens. Throughout, the seasonal quartet is infused alternately with allusions to and engagements with Botticelli, Lewis Carroll, Catherine Mansfield, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Aldous Huxley, amongst others. A maternal spirit presides over each book through the presence of a woman artist, including Pauline Boty, Barbara Hepworth, Tacita Dean, and Lorenzo Mazzetti. The concentration on a multiplicity of identities within a single British identity highlights what risks being lost by focusing on a narrow sense of nationalism. Borders play a significant role in these books, and these borders themselves assume a multiplicity of identities. National borders are recognised as a mechanism and metaphor for exclusion, for an increasingly not very united kingdom. Just as the borders that open onto Irish and Scottish culture are recognised as a mechanism and metaphor for inclusion, widening out from Britain and embracing Europe and the promise that European identity entails. As it looks outward from Britain and from the confines of British nationalism, the seasonal quartet has a political urgency, with one of its enduring themes being Britain's inhumanity toward the victims of the global refugee crisis. The quartet also illuminates, through the prism of Brexit, crucial contemporary issues of climate change, mental health, female allyship, and the threats posed by social media and political manipulation. As Erica Wagner notes, Ali Smith understands division, and her characters are who they are: original, curious, conflicted, damaged, hopeful. Underpinning this seasonal quartet, and much of Ali Smith's output, is an uncompromising faith in art and a fervent belief in the capacity of the imagination. These novels forward the argument of how fiction and the novel today can help us make sense of the human condition. The third novel in the series, Spring, does so explicitly with recourse to the music of Beethoven. This is not done by attempting to render music in the terms of discourse. Instead, through the narrative of her fiction, Smith urges that we pay attention to and engage with art on its own terms. Music is invoked, but never translated. The very act of engaging with the Beethoven song presented in the book allows us to consider anew the question of humanity as it relates to Beethoven's music, and, perhaps more importantly, the degree to which Beethoven's music can put us in touch with our own humanity. There is a resonance to be found in this engagement, moreover, in that it seems to make us more alert and more alive to the ethical and moral choices put before us in this book. This talk is concerned with how Ali Smith weaves Beethoven into the narrative of Spring as just one strand in a richly intertextual fabric that she then positions around the critical edges of the global refugee crisis. Beethoven as a figure, of course, is an ideological minefield, which is just one of the risks we take when we indulge, with Ali Smith, in the thrill of perilous border crossings. In our age of walls and lockdown, throughout this talk, those crossings will see us do the following: transgress the newly erected border between Britain and the European Union, cross the line between art and academic discourse, consider the perceived boundary between high and low art, negotiate the meeting place between the new and the known, contemplate the relationship between past and future, and navigate the uncertain terrain that lies between ethics and criticism. Beethoven is introduced to the novel by way of the character Patricia Heal, or Paddy as she is referred to, an Irish-born screenwriter of some brilliance who, along with her longtime collaborator and soulmate Richard Leese, made a groundbreaking TV drama in 1972 about the far-reaching cost of the Holocaust, called Die Hoffnung. The passage reads: Paddy sat next to a man at a Beethoven concert at the Wigmore Hall sometime in the late 1960s. Die Hoffnung, he said, and smiled at her. She'd thought it was his name, and told him hers. Then she'd seen in the programme it was the title of one of the songs. They'd gone out to dinner after. They'd probably slept together. He'd told her almost nothing about himself. Paddy, sharp as an arrowhead, had gathered a great deal. He was half German, half English. He'd been shafted by the worst of both. He'd lost a lot at the hands of both family, friends, home, all gone, and so on. And yet the most hopeful man I've ever met, she said at the time. I don't mean naively, I mean profoundly. Whereas music features pervasively in the fictional output of Ali Smith, it is usually jazz or popular music, with this book also invoking Florence and the Machine's 2018 album, High as Hope. It seems most unlikely for Beethoven to find a place in one of her novels. Before 2010, Ali Smith thought that classical music was not for her. Around that time, she made the decision to listen to a piece of Beethoven every day for a month. She was astonished at her own response to this music, which she deemed to be, and I quote, as modernist as Frank Gehry architecture, as timeless as things dug up in Greece from millennia ago, as uncompromising as history, as inventive and colourful as Picasso and Hockney. I find it invigorating to hear Smith's thoughts on Beethoven as a great literary figure who first encountered his music when she was in her late 40s. Her Beethoven journey, she says, has never not been enlightening, exciting, and a fusion of pleasure and meditation. Your mind opens and dimensionalizes as you listen. Whatever it is, it'll be layered with an understanding of social negotiation and of the heft, the shadow, and the forward push of time. She began at Opus 1 and listened to that piece every day for a month, before turning to Opus 2 and so on. Calculating from when she began this journey in 2010, she would have happened upon Beethoven's first setting of Die Hoffnung, Opus 32, at some point early in 2013.
Den Gram verschleierst, der eine zarte Seele quält. O Hoffnung, lass durch dich emporgehoben, den Dulder den Dulder ahnen, dass dort oben ein Engel seine Tränen zählt.
It's possible that this effortlessly simple strophic setting, with its E-flat major optimism, rendered darker by touches of minor and a pervasive sighing figure, is the song Smith had in mind when she placed the character Andy Hoffnung at the centre of her exploration of hope. More likely, however, is that it was Beethoven's later 1815 setting of this same poem addressed to hope by Christoph August Tiedge. As Opus 94, this would have found its way onto her Beethoven turntable, so to speak, late in 2017. The chronology is important. The second novel in the seasonal quartet, Winter, was published on 2nd of November 2017. And with the tight 6-week turnaround from delivery of manuscript to publication required of Hamish Hamilton in order for this series of novels to be viable, Smith would have delivered this manuscript in late September 2017. Immediately thereafter, it seems likely that she turned her attention to the next novel in the series, Spring. At that time, the fraught political landscape in the UK was still reeling from the murder of the MP Joe Cox on 16th of June 2016, and shortly after that, the result of the Brexit referendum on 24th of June. On the far side of the Atlantic, the US general election led to the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2017. All of this is woven into the fabric of autumn and winter. Yet it continues to inform the narrative of spring, which can be understood as an interrogation in fictional form of how xenophobia is used to justify the unthinkably inhumane. Highlights of the refugee crisis, if we may call them that, over the last decade include Theresa May's hostile environment policy of 2012, which resorted to methods such as go-home vans telling illegal immigrants to leave the country, and her dismissive references to cosmopolitanism. If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. The language of swarms of migrants that Nigel Farage adopted in his Brexit canvassing in 2015 came just 2 months before the shocking images of the 3-year-old Syrian boy Alan Kurdi washed up on a beach near the Turkish resort of Bodrum. Nigel Farage's 2016 Breaking Point, the EU has failed us all campaign, echoed, if not emulated, Theresa May's van strategy. Trump's administrative actions in 2017 on immigration and refugee status included cutting federal funding for sanctuary cities who refused to comply with immigration enforcement measures, suspending the refugee admissions program, and the 3 executive actions collectively known as the Trump travel ban, issued on Holocaust Memorial Day in 2017. These placed stringent restrictions on those bad dudes, to quote the former US president, that is, citizens of Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, from travelling to the US. That executive order was then amended to remove Iraq from the list, only to add restrictions on Chad, North Korea, and Venezuela, just as Sudan was removed. Slightly later, from April to June 2018, the Trump administration family separation policy led to children being separated from their parents and put in cages. This forms the landscape upon which Spring was drawn, and against which Ali Smith would have heard Beethoven's second setting of Andy Hoffnung for the first time, and then listened to it every day for a month.
Ein Gott sei, ob einst erfülle, was die Sehnsucht weinend sich verspricht. Ob vor irgendeinem seinem Weltgericht sich dies rätselhafte Sein enthülle.
This deeply pensive song opens with a searching recitative, with the performance direction poco sostenuto, which Beethoven used for works that were serious and foreboding between about 1808 and 1815. The prefatory gesture of the recitative was absent from Beethoven's Opus 32 setting, both in terms of the first stanza of Tiedge's poem and the expressive, decidedly operatic inflection that gives rise to its three entreaties. Whether there be a God, whether he will one day fulfill those promises which human longing tearfully imagines, whether this enigmatic being will reveal himself at some last judgment. These entreaties, heard in the dark and suspenseful key of B-flat minor, arrest the melodic flow of the piano on each occasion. As the music searches for a way out of the depths of this highly chromatic B-flat minor, we emerge into an allegro in D major. Despite seeming to be triumphant in itself, this is attenuated by the shadow of the forthcoming G major, giving voice to the assertion that man must hope, he does not ask. A larghetto piano interlude allows the poet, speaking in the third person as the sufferer, to address hope in the first person. Registral shifts are a pronounced characteristic of this song. In this second stanza, in addition to the affective sweeping octaves, the repeated appeals to hope seem to soar heavenward, just as descriptions of suffering witness the voice plume the depths of despair. If I were teaching this song to my students in the formal analysis class that we are currently undertaking, I would want them to notice the manner in which, in the midst of this G major stanza, the repeated supplication to hope, that this sufferer feels that somewhere above an angel counts his tears, intensifies on each occasion, with the interval of the melisma widening from a sixth over a dominant to a seventh over a dominant seventh, before being filled in with lamenting falling semitones on the way to a cadential sigh. As Amanda Glowert suggests, the song's vocal line almost breaks under such extremes.
Zarte Seele quält, o Hoffnung, lass durch dich emporgehoben den Dulder ahnen, dass dort oben ein Engel seine Tränen zählt. O Hoffnung, dich emporgehoben, den Dulder ahnen, dass dort oben ein Engel seine Tränen zählt, ein Engel seine Tränen zählt, ein Engel seine Tränen zählt.
With each stanza in this song comes a change of key, character, and texture. Lewis Lockwood ventures that this is so that each element of the poem can receive its own, more sensitive musical sculpting. This is unusual for a lied, that most intimate of art forms, one that in this instance reaches beyond itself in terms of its operatic ambition. In keeping with the grand scale of opera, this song, as Charles Osborne observes, sounds less like a private reflection than a public utterance. It seems entirely apt to the socially conscious subject matter of Spring, a book that takes shelter, as Ali Smith evocatively describes it, under Shakespeare's late play Pericles of Tyre. That play of migration and family separation is concerned with good and bad governance, issues that come together in Spring and find one outlet in German music and poetry in the guise of Andy Hoffnung. This allows me to wonder why contemporary German politics might have been on Ali Smith's mind as she worked on this book. In 2015, Angela Merkel opened Germany's borders to millions of migrants, employing the now famous phrase, "Wir schaffen das." We'll handle this. Between 2015 and 16, 1,750,000 refugees entered Germany via what became known as the Balkan route from Syria, North Africa, Iraq, and Afghanistan. EU member states were officially responsible for these refugees under the EU's Dublin regulation, which the novelist Colm Tóibín has called out for censure, at the same time critiquing Ireland's role in the refugee crisis. And I quote, "Refugees and asylum seekers can only have their cases heard in the country where they first applied for asylum. No other country can deal with their case. Ostensibly, the Dublin regulation was a way to stop asylum-seeking shopping for the softest country or the most affluent. But in fact, it was a way for many countries to wash their hands of this refugee problem, or attempt to do so." Merkel's government responded to the Dublin regulation by allowing people to cross the border first and have their asylum claims checked later. Political and public opinions on this matter were as conflicted then as they are now. Many have interpreted Merkel's having made room for the wretched of the earth in this way as forging an inverted link with Germany's past. Donald Trump called the opening of Germany's borders a catastrophic mistake. Nigel Farage told Fox News that it was the worst decision a European leader has made in modern times. Pushing back against Merkel's open border, Germany's Die Linke party launched Aufstehen, Get Up, a political movement that combined left-wing economic policy with exclusionary social protections. The far right entered the German parliament in 2017 for the first time since 1945 in the form of the Alternative für Deutschland party. As they called for Germany's borders to be closed, they also demanded an end to Germany's preoccupation with public memory. Here, as elsewhere in the world, there was an attempt for memory and borders to be shut down together. In autumn, and later in summer, where strands of all the novels in the seasonal quartet are brought together, Smith draws a connection between the UK's German internment camps during World War II and the current immigrant detention centres peppered throughout the UK, both concerned with the treatment of enemy aliens, and signalling, as Natasha Hakimi Zapata perceptively puts it, that Britain's perennial refusal to grapple with its past has set the nation on a dizzying path of tragic repetition. In Spring, the allusion to Germany's past, through the prism of hope in Andy Hoffnung, approaches the matter of a country's capacity to confront its past and its future, and positions that matter in relation to borders. The third stanza of Tiedge's poem is the site of memory and recollection, as the sufferer, still in the third person, continues to address hope in the first. Bare descending octaves illustrate the imagery of buried urns. The urn, that ornate vase, the vessel in which humanity gathered items to carry with them, that proud symbol of elegant beauty that holds our earthly remains, or that symbol of death. As the voice sustains a low C sharp, we reach one of the most profound depths of Andy Hoffnung.
Geliebte Stimmen schweigen, wenn unter ausgestorbenen Zweigen verödet die Erinnerung sitzt. Danach
Tiedge's poem comes from the first canto of his lyric didactic poem called Urania, on God, eternity, and freedom. This enjoyed great popularity in the first half of the 19th century. As Paul Reed notes, this poem within a poem appears in the first canto, subtitled Lamentations of the Doubter, at a point where the poet, acting as devil's advocate, questions the very existence of God. The wonders of nature suggest an orderly and benevolent world ruler, but the human world, where evil so often triumphs over good, suggests otherwise. Indeed, the invisible is made visible, with the spectre of God being conjured up in Ali Smith's Spring through a chilling collage of racist social media vitriol, the kind targeted at immigrants on a regular basis that remains otherwise invisible to the population at large. Beethoven's setting of the last stanza of Tiedge's poem begins in D minor, the key of such weighty and consequential works in the German tradition as Mozart's Requiem and Don Giovanni. It is also the key of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, a work that numerous commentators have considered to rotate in the same expressive orbit as An die Hoffnung, not only because of the opening recitative that seems to emerge out of a void, but also because the poetry that is set on each occasion is alternately an ode to joy, an die Freude, and an ode to hope, an die Hoffnung. The imagery in Tiedge's closing stanza witnesses the sufferer in his final days look up in a defiant gesture to rail against fate. There is then one final plea to hope, that the sufferer might be permitted to behold behind this earthly dream the golden glow at the cloud's fringe from a sun close at hand. This is not a plea for heavenly redemption, nor indeed is it a plea for release from earthly suffering. This is merely a plea that as the sufferer takes leave of this world, he might be permitted one last glance of its beauty.
Und blickt auf das Schicksal anzuklagen, wenn scheidet über seinen Tagen die letzten Strahlen untergehen. Dann lass ihn den Rand des Erdentraumes, das Leuchten eines Wolkensaumes von einer nahen Sonne sieht, von einer nahen Sonne sieht.
Tiedge's poem ends here. Beethoven's setting, however, winds back to G major and a return of the second stanza, in which the sufferer had dared to ask hope that an angel might count his tears. This return to the second stanza speaks to an inability to escape from appealing to hope. The song ends with a short postlude, treated by Beethoven as an eminently refined closing gesture. Although the final words, O Hoffnung, come from the second stanza, the melodic motif to which they are attached belongs to the start of the song, that is, the first stanza that accommodated the searching recitative in which we first learnt of the sufferer's existential angst. Paul Reed characterises this opening as a full compendium of rhetorical devices, illustrative of religious doubt and human despair. Its chromatically descending bass line is redolent of the ancient topos of lament. The diabolic tritone occurs continually as diminished fifth and augmented fourth, and the chord of the diminished seventh avoids harmonic certainty. We've heard all of this earlier. By the end of the song, The motif to which we hear the words O Hoffnung is subtly changed, but the more sanguine perfect fifth seems inadequate to the task of transforming the expressive effect of the music at the outset on the question of whether there be a God, that inquiry having ended with a diminished fifth. The ending, then, brings us back to the beginning, the song itself now confronting both its own past and its future. For in returning to the first verse, we once again encounter the singular mention of judgment in this song, and the prospect that it holds for future events. This judgment, moreover, pertains not to the sufferer, but instead to a God, one who may or may not exist. In her exploration of mercy in the Oxford Handbook of Western Music and Philosophy, Martha Nussbaum draws a helpfully succinct distinction, for our present purpose, between mercy and compassion, one that she then applies to a series of operas by Mozart. And I quote, "Mercy is a mental inclination, but not necessarily an emotion. Compassion is an emotional reaction to the plight of another person. Mercy recognizes that the person is at fault. It belongs, so to speak, at the penalty phase of a trial, after conviction. Compassion, by contrast, need have nothing at all to do with fault. Indeed, as typically understood, it recognizes a large role for uncontrolled events in getting into the bad situation that inspires the painful emotion. And it typically ascribes to these uncontrolled events considerable importance for human flourishing." Nussbaum's distinction is illuminating for Beethoven's Die Hoffnung and the darkness that falls over its G major ending. I'm not convinced of the claim Nussbaum makes that a musical setting has the capacity to express mercy or compassion, even though I admire many of the fine nuances of her argument. Instead, I make the case that mercy and compassion are the property of the perceiving subject, and that it is the manner in which the poem is treated in this song that enhances the listener's capacity for such perception. Rather than allowing the listener to move on from the three entreaties articulated at the outset of the song, the simple gesture of conflating a godlike figure with the personification of hope invites the listener to revisit these matters, now fully informed of the plight of the sufferer. To whom, the song seems to ask, do the concepts of mercy and compassion apply in the scenario of this poem? And for whom is this judgment intended? As the song veers between elation and despair, and between hope and hopelessness, it's worth recalling the character Paddy's description of Die Hoffnung. I realised, talking with him, that true hope's actually a matter of the absence of hope. The edification to be found in Ali Smith's Spring may not require an understanding of the musical nuances observed throughout this talk. It's possible that many readers would not scratch the surface of the conflation of Die Hoffnung with Die Hoffnung and still have a full appreciation of the diverse choices of ethical and moral conduct that are presented to the reader in Spring. It does not detract from the literary ingenuity or the playful virtuosity of Ali Smith having the song name become the man's name to note that the personification of hope is already present in Tiedge's poem, in which the poet consistently addresses hope in the first person, as befits the genre of the ode. It might be the case that our appreciation of the intertextuality of Spring is enhanced by an understanding of this Beethoven song. And here I hasten to add that what I offer is merely my own subjective response to the song and lays no claim to a definitive reading. What is certain, however, is that for those with an open-eared curiosity amongst the readers of Ali Smith's Spring, the manner in which she treats Die Hoffnung in the book, conflating a poem, a song, and a character, has the capacity to increase our empathy. This, moreover, is not abstract empathy, detached from a tangible object. It's worth noting that Smith's unusually sensitive allusion to Beethoven does not rely on the tropes of heroism or genius, aspects of the composer's reception that musicologists such as Nicholas Matthew, Jennifer Ronyak, Linda Shaver-Gleason, Kira Thurman and Laura Tunbridge have done a fine job of highlighting and challenging in recent years. Instead, with her quintessentially human compassion for the plight of seemingly unremarkable individuals, Ali Smith simply allows the complex humanity inherent in Beethoven's setting of Tiedge's poem to speak to the global refugee crisis. Ali Smith is the patron of the Refugee Tales, where volunteers befriend and support immigration detainees and then tell their tales, often in collaboration with the detainees. In the words of the poet David Hurd, the Refugee Tales reject the terms of a debate that criminalises human movement, and a system that allows refugees to be picked up and detained routinely and arbitrarily. Modelled on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and operating on the principle that solidarity should begin with reading, authors from Patience Agbabe, Helen MacDonald and Bernardine Evaristo have contributed to this project. Spring is not part of the Refugee Tales, and yet it clearly has an anchor in that initiative, with Ali Smith having interviewed detainees, or deets as they're called in the book. She is concerned with how immigration removal centres reduce the humanity, both of the people detained and those who work therein, often by making these people invisible, disappearing people from a system that has already disappeared them. Within the framework of the novel, she charts the corrosive effect that these technically not prisons have on the human spirit. Everything we have encountered in this talk is positioned around borders and the divisions they impose. In counterpoint with this, and fueling the hopeless hope of this book, is the wide-eyed optimism of the character Florence Smith in Spring, a child with benevolent intelligence. What if, the girl says, instead of saying, this border divides these places, we said, this border unites these places. This border holds together these two really interesting different places. What if we declared border crossings places where, listen, when you crossed them, you yourself became doubly possible? It is in this spirit of enhanced possibility that Smith draws together disparate voices in a single European tradition in Spring, and positions Beethoven in conversation with Dickens, Tiedge, Shakespeare, Picasso and Tacita Dean, with the spirit of Patricia Heal, or Paddy, presiding over all of them. It is also this same tradition that animates the ghosts in Ali Smith's machine, that is, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin and Ernst Bloch, vying against one another to determine who has the greater purchase on the concept of hope. The sense of enhanced possibility that Spring brings further reaches across socio-economic boundaries, recalling a time when, armed with nothing more than her own imagination, and in an age before a chorus of voices would tell her that that which Bourdieu refers to as the most precious cultural gains of humanity were the preserve of the elite, a teenager could follow her passion, funded by nothing more than her own enthusiasm. When I was 15, she wrote, and had seen Your Andy Hoffnung on TV and loved it, I found the Beethoven song, Andy Hoffnung, on a cassette. I listened to it. I even went to the library and looked up the German words and worked out what they meant with the German dictionary. Then I got the train through to Aberdeen, where they had copies of The Listener in the stacks. And I looked up what your friend Paddy said when they interviewed her about writing Andy Hoffnung and why she'd called it that. And I loved how she'd the song name become the man's name. I loved how she made words that mean dedicated to hope into an actual person, how she gave the words a human shape. By framing Beethoven's Andy Hoffnung in the unassuming and disarming manner that we find it in Spring, with its thrill of perilous border crossings, Ali Smith positions Beethoven's music as a means through which we may access, if not enlarge, our own sense of humanity. This opens out onto a broader discourse in the work of Ali Smith, concerning that which is ephemeral and that which is lasting. Reflecting on one last border, the meeting place between art and time, in her book Artful, she ventures that, and I quote, "Real art, as opposed to more transient art, which is real too, just for less time, will hold us at all our different ages, like it held all the people before us, and will hold all the people after us." The art that inspires Ali Smith's characters seems to widen their capacity for empathy, and insists that they take stock both of the beauty and cruelty present in all of nature, not least human nature. In her Goldsmiths Prize lecture, called The Novel in the Age of Trump, she confesses that the novels she likes best are the ones that invite or demand that their reader take part in their making, be present in them, be creative in response to them, and, in being part, be the opposite of excluded, be active, be alive to them, and them, in turn, alive to the reader. For those of us who wish, in response to this, to have an imaginative involvement with Beethoven's Anti-Hoffnung, this has the power to transform us, allowing us to rehumanize those who have been dehumanized, and thereby allowing us to hope for, if not to enact, a kinder, more benevolent, and more just world.
Sanft und weich den Grab verschleierst, dir eine zarte Seele quält, o Hoffnung, lass durch dich emporgehoben den Dulder ahnen, dass dort oben ein Engel seine Tränen zählt. O Hoffnung, lass durch dich emporgehoben den Dulder ahnen, dass dort oben ein Engel seine Tränen zählt, ein Engel seine Tränen zählt, ein Engel